joined us out of the policy side of Stanford, being interested to continue her credentials in civil engineering. She did her undergrad at Clemson, a lesser-known football school. Is still a fairly serious football fan. She actually got to go to the championships this year. Not the happiest time. Last year was happier, right? But anyway, she's done really interesting work on crowdsourcing. She has been a student who has a huge appetite for travel. Every spring break, every other break, she's off in some distant part of the world. But most of the work you'll hear about today was either in the US or the UK. And looking at crowdfunding of projects, not necessarily funding major significant amounts of money in the project, but gathering crowdfunding support for a project as evidence of local community support for projects. And she's going to describe some of the challenges, some of the theoretical insights that she's gotten from this work. So thank you all for coming so early in the morning. This is very early for Stanford. And thanks to the committee, particularly to our outside chair, Bruce King. So I'll hand it over to Bruce.
Okay, so we will follow the standard procedure, and Kate will give a presentation, which will then throw open questions to the audience. And we'll end around 9 o'clock, and then have a meeting of people who want to make it. So, Kate, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming here at such early morning. And I also really like to thank my committee, who has been here throughout this process, whether that's fairly recently, as in Bruce and Martin, or throughout this entire process since day one. Today, I have the pleasure of talking about crowdfunding our cities and what that actually means when it comes to stakeholder dynamics and innovative infrastructure delivery. And even though this research has only been over the past 4.5, 5 years, the motivation for it comes from long before then. So over the past 8 years, I've had the great gratitude to be able to work, as Ray was saying, all throughout the world. All of these different triangles are locations that I've worked with local governments, research civic organizations working on local infrastructure delivery, and work with community activists on how to actually deliver infrastructure projects for communities. And regardless of where I've been, one thing has remained true. Infrastructure, specifically local infrastructure projects, are often overlooked and underfunded. And so this past summer, when I was in London, England, a survey came out and a report came out that detailed how lack of investment in local road projects had an economic cost of nearly $2 billion in all of the UK. The summer before that, I was in Cordoba, Argentina, where I worked with a local non-governmental organization, NGO, where we were looking at public electrocution, and in particular, how to reduce exposed wires like this in public spaces and reduce the amount of public safety and health risk. And a little closer to home, in Memphis, Tennessee, recent lack of investment in pedestrian infrastructure, so sidewalks and crosswalks, have resulted in increased pedestrian deaths throughout the city. So lack of investment in these smaller infrastructure projects have huge economic and health consequences. And the reason why this continues to be a problem throughout the United States and the world is a tension between the need for increased infrastructure assets. So this map shows the rate of urbanization throughout the United States. As more people are moving to cities, the stress on infrastructure networks increases, meaning that city governments and local developers need to be developing and managing and delivering new and maintaining older infrastructure projects. At the same time as this is happening, there's been a decline in the investment of dollars into these projects. And so even though these two figures show that there's this tension between need for increased infrastructure but decreased investment in that infrastructure, it's also occurring in cities around the world. And today we're going to take a finer look at this through the city of Memphis, Tennessee. So over the past 200 years, Memphis has expanded outward as people have left the urban core, which is this blue area on the left-hand side of the screen, and moved to the suburbs. The city government has continued to annex nearby suburbs and neighborhoods, trying to reclaim property taxes from the white flight that's happened from the core of Memphis. And as the city assets have expanded, because the boundaries have also expanded, the number of dollars coming in from property taxes has remained the same. So the tension that we saw on the previous screen rings true for the city as well. And when I spoke to the city engineer, he said this in particular. In the last 18 years, funding has been cut by about 30%. The city's not getting any smaller and there's not fewer roads. And so because the local government is unable to actually invest and continue to maintain this growing number of assets, citizens have actually taken it upon themselves to construct and maintain their own infrastructure projects. So this picture on the left-hand side shows 3 volunteers who are actually painting their own bicycle lane down Broad Avenue. And this happened a few days before they had a 2-day event where they allowed community residents and citizens in Memphis to come and experience what reinvestment would look like for Broad Avenue. And this event sparked so much curiosity and enthusiasm around this protected, or this bicycle lane, and other infrastructure improvements that they made temporarily on the street, that the Business Improvement District of Broad Avenue, on this slide, in this street, decided that they were going to crowdfund their own protected bicycle lane, taking that painted, temporary bicycle lane and making it into a permanent asset for Broad Avenue. And the Business Improvement District, one of the champions of that organization, came forward and said, if we raise the funds for a state-of-the-art protected bicycle lane design via crowdfunding, will you fund the construction? So if we think about the city engineer who's sitting at their desk and having to maintain and construct increasing number of assets as the city is expanding, but has limited resources to do so, this looks like a pretty nice offer. Somebody's going to come by with crowdfunded dollars to help you instigate the construction of a new project that the community wants. But what exactly is crowdfunding? So crowdfunding occurs when individuals, instead of professional parties, choose to give, either donate or invest financial resources for the delivery of a specific project. So many of us might know of Kickstarter, Indiegogo, GoFundMe, which are general crowdfunding platforms that allow you to give your dollars if you want to support somebody's college tuition, a loved one's health operation, your favorite band's new album. But there are actually new crowdfunding platforms that work specifically on channeling investments and donations towards infrastructure projects. One of the very first was IOE, which is based out of Brooklyn, New York, who is channeling donations towards projects like the Protected Bicycle Lane in Memphis. But since then, over 70 crowdfunding websites have actually been established and formed that help channel all of these dollars and investments, either donation, debt, or equity crowdfunding for different types of infrastructure. And so those aren't just your protected bicycle lanes, but also real estate projects, community solar projects, community parks, neighborhood gardens. And so this is really taking people's investment socially and making it into a financial investment. And if we take a look at the implications and the consequences of infrastructure, crowdfunding infrastructure, it's important to understand where the baseline is. So typically, a local infrastructure project, and we'll think about a bike lane, a protected bicycle lane, is delivered by the project owner, the local government, who sits at the middle of the stakeholder network. And they're responsible for channeling and building relationships with different stakeholders. So in terms of the transfer of money, they bring in dollars from most likely a government budget, all the way to project partners who are your construction managers, your designers, your planners. In terms of information exchange, the government is also exchanging information with community organizations, civic organizations, and community members, getting them involved early on in the design and planning of the asset, and then communicating with them to some extent, and most recently to a limited extent, on the delivery of these assets. But when we start to crowdfund infrastructure, the stakeholder network shifts dramatically. What happens is the civic organization, so in our case, the Business Improvement District, becomes a project sponsor. And they sit in a central position in the stakeholder network, and they're the one who starts discussing with, engaging with the community members in the hopes of getting money from them for the crowdfunded project, transferring that money to the project owners and the project partners via the crowdfunding platform that they work with. And so in this new stakeholder network, we have 3 new stakeholders: the project sponsor, the the crowdfunding platform, and the crowdfunders. And this leads us to our research objective. What are the stakeholder dynamics when crowdfunding is used for local infrastructure delivery? So today, we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about that in 3 parts. So the first part, which we're currently sitting in, is the introduction. I discussed the observed problem, our research objective. We're about to head into an interactive case. In putting to practice actual crowd strategies, we're going to be crowdsourcing the middle part of this presentation, which means that you're going to be deciding, at this point in time, if we're going to look at crowdfunding dynamics through the lens of financial intermediation, social movements, or cross-sector partnerships. But no worries, if you are not part of the majority, we're doing majority rules today. We will be wrapping up everything in part 3, talking about the findings from all 3 of these dissertation chapters. So each lens was one of the chapters of my dissertation, talking about the practical and theoretical contributions, and finally, our future research. So, without further ado, let's dive into what each of these 3 different lenses actually looks like. So, remember that we have these 3 new stakeholders here, and if we look at it through the lens of financial intermediation, we're actually looking at how crowdfunding is a new financial intermediary that is helping crowdfunders and community members channel dollars towards the project sponsor, who is the capital-seeking agent in this case. And what are the implications of using a new stakeholder, an online crowdfunding platform, to be this new financial intermediary instead of using tax dollars for the delivery of infrastructure projects? Lens 2 looks at social movements and the relationship between crowdfunders, the project sponsor, and the project owner. And in particular, how the exchange of resources between the project sponsor and crowdfunders creates a social movement to then influence the local government as the project owner at the end of the day on which project they're going to decide to construct, and also how they're going to go about constructing that project. And lastly, our 3rd lens of cross-sector partnerships takes a look at the new governance structure and partnership that's built between the project sponsor and the project owner, and how they actually deliver the project at the end of the day by channeling financial resources to project partners, like our designers, planners, and construction managers. So, if we're going to put this back in context to the Memphis case we discussed before, remember that the city engineer in Memphis, who's the one who has to decide if they're going to accept the crowdfunded dollars, he's sitting in a position where he's responsible for an increasing number of assets with declining resources, budget constraints, and less external grant options. But needs to understand before he makes this decision, should I accept these crowdfunded dollars, what crowdfunding stakeholder dynamics are most important. So, we're going to choose either lens 1, financial intermediation, is that most important to him, social movements, or cross-sector partnerships. So this is our interactive part, and even if you are online right now, you can pull out your phone, your smartphones, and go to slido.com and type in crowdfund cities. So I'll give everyone about 2 minutes to do this. It's probably the only point in time you're sitting in the classroom and the presenter is like, pull out your phones, be on them, participate. So. Since we're live polling. So here are the instructions here. Join at slido.com, #crowdfundcities. Trying to walk the walk here today. So crowdfunding, using crowd strategies, community engagement. So, cool. We'll give everybody about another 15 seconds. Okay. Well, it's like a race. Okay. Okay, awesome. So we've hit that time. It looks like cross-sector partnerships is our winner by a slight margin. So I'm going to stop the voting at this time. Thank you everyone for participating. We're going to head into cross-sector partnerships. So here we are here. Don't worry if you chose financial intermediation or social movements. We're going to wrap this all up at the end and talk about the findings from those sections as well. So if you can remember, Lens 3 talks about cross-sector partnerships, and it's this relationship here, how the project sponsor and the project owner partnership that allows them to interact with project partners. And the reason why we can apply this lens of cross-sector partnerships is because this relationship mimics what we see in mutual accountability, voluntary or contractual relationship building, shared investment and reputational risk between the project sponsor and the project owner, and joint design and execution. And typically, when we read about cross-sector partnerships, there's a framework in which we evaluate them and understand them by. So I'm going to give a little bit of the research backstory. The first thing to consider are general antecedent conditions, which are the reasons why a cross-sector partnership forms in the first place. And this could be for changes in resources or policy legal frameworks, prior sector failure, and changing dynamics between stakeholders. And so in the past, when governments have decided to pursue cross-sector partnerships, specifically public-private partnerships, they're interested in seeking the innovative and financial capabilities from the private sector to be able to move a project forward. But once we've established the cross-sector partnership, it's important to understand what the shared motivations are for each of the different partners that is coming to play. And we're going to be talking a lot about nonprofit public partnerships today, and what's important to understand is that these shared motivations, and we think about them in terms of institutional logics and hybridization, is that the nonprofit sector is coming from a standpoint in which they need to represent their own community's interests. So those are their donors, those are the neighborhoods that they reside in. Whereas the public sector, in our case we're going to talk about the local government, needs to think about equity and access for all of the neighborhoods and communities in the jurisdiction that they oversee. So you can start to think about how there might be differences in the shared motivation, or there might not even be a shared motivation for why they're pursuing a project in the first place. The second thing to consider is the collaboration processes. So we just went through a collaboration process ourselves. If we think about our two partners and how they're not only interacting with each other, but how they're interacting with other stakeholders, so how are they reaching out to the community, how are they reaching out to the project partners and other funders, that's also a critical part of understanding and evaluating our cross-sector partnerships. At the same time, it's important to look at collaboration structures between the two partners. So how are they set up to govern each other and govern the project as a whole? And so there's a seesaw movement that happens between contractual arrangements and trust. So as you have a more formal relationship and build contracts between two partners, there's a less reliance on trust. But when you have less contracts in place, there's no contractual legal document guiding you, it's reliant on this built trust between the two partners and past experiences that they've had together to sort of guide the partnership forward. And these last two collaboration processes and collaboration structures are mediated by apparent leadership and knowledge and resources between the two partners. So who is championing this project within each of the partner organizations, and what are the resources and knowledge that each partner organization is here to bring to the table. So that's a lot of that information and backstory, but we're really going to think about all of these factors when we come to the end of our story today, and in terms of how our own cases are going to play out and impact each of these, which leads us to the research question for this lens: how does crowdfunding, in different contexts, influence the creation and management of a cross-sector partnership? And that's in relationship to those factors we discussed before. So, to address this research question, I had to pick a research approach, and I decided to pick a grounded theory. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means and where that's coming from. And the first thing to understand is grounded theory is used for new phenomena. And the reason why we're thinking about it as a new phenomena is because crowdfunding in itself is an emerging phenomenon that is raising financial and social support for a project. And so because we're looking at a new phenomenon, we're going to use grounded theory, which means that we're going to use an inductive approach, so take all of the data from our cases and from there generate theory. Whereas traditional research, you start off with a hypothesis that you're going to test. Here we're using a grounded theory to sort of allow the creativity of the cases and not limit ourselves in terms of hypotheses. The second reason why I chose grounded theory was that we were looking specifically at local infrastructure delivery. And the reason why this was important is because grounded theory allows you to dive deep and understand the nuances and the context in which you're understanding local infrastructure delivery. Local infrastructure delivery is a resource-intensive process. It requires a lot of capital, not just financial capital, but technical capital. You have to involve a lot of stakeholders throughout the entire process to allow a project to be successful. The second reason that grounded theory was used for infrastructure delivery was that infrastructure delivery is a phased process. So you have to understand how the stakeholders are interacting from planning to design to construction and operations and maintenance. And during this process, there's fluctuating stakeholder power that allows different stakeholders to take responsibility over each of the phases. And lastly, and probably most importantly, infrastructure is a networked process. So it is anchored in its social, economic, and physical geographies, which means that to understand the real benefits of building a protected bicycle lane, you have to understand that it lies next to other bicycle infrastructure, it lies along an economic corridor, usually with nearby businesses that will be influenced and benefit from this new asset. You can really only understand that by being in place and allowing the details and data from the case to emerge as grounded theory tells us. So, talk a little bit about the research design as guided by grounded theory. So I went out, and because we're looking at crowdfunding in different contexts and evaluating the cross-sector partnerships there, we're interested in looking at a matched pairs case study. So what this means is we're selecting two cases that are similar in all respects besides one. And in this case, because we're talking about different contexts, we wanted to make sure that that was the one difference. So we're looking at two crowdfunded infrastructure projects, in this case, two protected bicycle lanes, which we'll talk about in a minute. They are similar scope and size and have similar stakeholders, but they do have different contexts. And so this then led us to the data collection design, where we're looking at ethnographic qualitative approach. So this relates to the networked effects of infrastructure delivery. So I went and looked at each of these two locations where these protected bicycle lanes were constructed. I conducted semi-structured interviews, went to public meetings, reviewed all the documents, not just of the projects, but historically and in context of what was going on in these cities. And I wrote my own memos on a regular basis to make sure I was not only taking information from my interviews, but also from these public meetings and our interactions just on a daily basis. And lastly, to analyze all of this data, I pursued open coding, which is a reflection of grounded theory. So I went line by line through each of the interview transcripts and assigned a theme to each of the lines. I then used constant comparison, which is a grounded theory strategy, of then tying in the literature to understand and make better sense of what was going on. Then, this led to a large group of themes that got whittled down at the end to a salient number of 7 to 10, and were sent to all of the participants as part of the validation process for this research. So they received a 2 to 3 page document that had the themes and substantial quotes to back up those themes, and then were able to respond to me and tell me, hey, this is what it's looking like, you're on the right path, no, go back and interview these other people, look at these other documents. And so this is a really key part of validating the results that I'm about to dive into. So, in terms of case selection strategy, remember we were looking at two crowdfunded protected bicycle lanes in different contexts. In the first project that was crowdfunded was the Hampline project, which we discussed at the very beginning of the day, and that was located in Memphis, Tennessee. A year later, a similar project, also protected bicycle lane, was crowdfunded in Denver, Colorado. So if you can see, these two cities are located on opposite sides of the map. Denver is located in the Mountain West region of the United States. Pretty entrepreneurial spirit there, really trying to combat with tensions, I guess, or tensions and technical expertise in the Bay Area and Seattle. Whereas Memphis, Tennessee is a hub for transport. It's the FedEx's hub for transporting materials and mail all across the country, and has a pretty diverse, controversial history, I should say. And one way to think about this is in terms of all these different factors. And this is just, we're not going to dive into this too much, but really to understand where each of them is sitting in terms of population growth. So Denver is expecting a lot of population growth as compared to Memphis. Although they have similar populations, Denver has much higher economic range, which means that it's bringing a lot more money than Memphis is these days. Denver also has more bicycle lanes, and part of that is because it has increased density. So there is actually a better infrastructure network set up for them to allow for building bicycle lanes. So just some things to keep in mind as we move forward with each of our cases. So the first case we're going to talk about is the case in Denver, which I title Adapting for the Future. And the reason why we think about it in these terms is because the mayor's office, during the time that they're constructing protected bicycle lanes, is really looking to position downtown Denver as one of the best downtowns for attracting millennials and tech industries from all over the country. So that sort of speaks to the tension it has with the Bay Area and Seattle, trying to attract new companies and new talent. And for this case, we're looking specifically at the Arapahoe Protected Bicycle Lane, which is right in the downtown area. So this is a picture of before the Arapahoe bike lane was built. The story of Denver, even though it was crowdfunded, and the Arapahoe Bicycle Lane was crowdfunded in 2013, the story starts all the way back in 2009, where they hired their first bicycle manager. And shortly after that, they set up the first large-scale urban bike sharing program in the entire United States. So who here has ever participated in a bike sharing program or ridden on a bike sharing program? Okay. So the city not only has to be able to set up these hubs of bikes throughout the city, but also needs to have bicycle infrastructure to be able to connect all of them. So this is important for motivating the need for infrastructure and how it pertains to crowdfunding. The next thing that happens is that tech companies start to want bicycle lanes. They see that this is a competitive edge if they can have bicycle lanes in the downtown area to attract millennials who no longer want to drive to work. And so this motivates the construction and completion of the first protected bicycle lane by 2014. And shortly thereafter motivates the conceptual design and the crowdfunding of its second protected bicycle lane, which is our Arapahoe bike lane. And within a year after it's been crowdfunded, the bike lane is constructed and the mayor comes out to cut the ribbon for the protected bicycle lane and promises 3 more by the end of the next year. So it's a pretty unique situation. The size and scope of this project usually takes much longer than 1 year to go from conceptual design all the way to construction. So they're leveraging their past knowledge of bicycle lanes. They're also using the entrepreneurial spirit of the Business Improvement District to move this project forward. Now we're going to talk about this in contrast with Memphis. So Memphis is more of a story of disinvestment and revitalization. And we talked about this at the very beginning, where the city engineer is needing to provide more assets, but the budget is being cut. And so our story focuses on the HAMP line, which you've already delved into a little bit. And this is the picture of the protected bicycle lane before it was constructed. So there's a bike lane there that was painted by the citizens, but it has not been, the protected aspect of this bike lane has not been constructed. So the story of Memphis, even though the crowdfunding didn't happen until much later on, the story begins in 2010, where Bicycling magazine ranks Memphis as one of the worst cities for cycling in the United States. So you can see there's a little bit of a contrast. Denver is already building the first bike sharing program in the country, and Memphis is a little bit behind. So what happens is shortly afterwards, the mayor makes an announcement that he says, I'm going to build 55 miles of bicycle lane in the next few years. He then hires a bicycle manager, and shortly after that, we have that 2-day event where they actually go out, not the city, but the Business Improvement District on Broad Avenue, to paint the bicycle lane. So capitalizing on all the support, they go out there, they begin conceptual design, stakeholder outreach. They conduct their crowdfunding campaign for this short 6-week period, but this is after the stakeholder outreach, so they're really capitalizing on all the stakeholder outreach and engagement that they've done beforehand. They have design review with the city, and to this day, this project is still not constructed. So, I did hear a couple weeks ago when I set out the invitation for this presentation that they're beginning construction in March. So very excited for them. So I already put it at the end. So we're going to talk about, yes.
Who paid for the design there?
So the design was paid for by the crowdfunding campaign that was instigated by the Business Improvement District. Okay.
It looks like it started before the fundraising campaign.
Crowdfunding here. So the design, they already had a little bit of dollars outside of the online campaign from a bigger donor, and so then they were able to bring in the additional funding to finish out the design for their state-of-the-art protected bicycle lane through the crowdfunding process. Okay, so putting this back into context, you can remember Denver has high economic power, resources, and higher density, and it's got the shifting demographic trend. So really trying to attract millennials and tech companies to Denver by building protected bicycle lanes. In Memphis, we have low government resources, low density, but at the same time, we have strong community resources. So we've seen this because the Business Improvement District along Broad Avenue has gone out on their own to private donors in the area, and also through the crowdfunding campaign to pay for the entire design aspect of the protected bicycle lane. And so, to bring this context and all the data collected into focus, we're going to think about the findings in terms of this three-phase step. So we're going to start with what the quotes were that led to our findings, how the literature that we discussed previously has helped to refine those findings, so at the end we can have a new theory. So if you're ready, we're going to do something like this. So we're going to start with our thematic category 1, which was reviewed by all of our participants in this research, about responsibility. So what happens in both of these cases, the Business Improvement District for either downtown Denver or Broad Avenue goes to the city and says, we will crowdfund the design of the protected bicycle lane if you will build the construction of it. And so if we think about cross-sector partnerships and what motivates a cross-sector partnership, it falls into our antecedent conditions. And typically for a nonprofit public partnership, like the one that we saw, they only form when the public sector gives financial resources to the nonprofit to start a program or initiative. But in both of these cases, we actually saw the nonprofit is motivating the partnership in the first place by providing their own resources. So Proposition 1, nonprofit organizations can start a partnership if they provide resources. Thematic category 2, alignment or misalignment. So in Denver, we saw that the mayor's office saw a real need for multimodal and in particular bike infrastructure for the downtown area. The bike manager was on board because their job is to provide new bicycle infrastructure, and so they had an alignment within their own organization to deliver our project. Whereas for the Hamp line in Memphis, we saw that the mayor wanted to push forward with this 55 miles of new bicycle lanes, but at the same time, we also saw that the city engineer doesn't have the funding to pay for new infrastructure. So there's this misalignment here of how the public sector is actually going to move forward with this cross-sector partnership. And we think about this in terms of shared motivations. So we talked about before that partners have different institutional logics, and there could possibly be different logics in the same organization that can block a partnership from moving forward. And so, our proposition number 2, partners must address hybridization between and within organizations. So what this finding shows is that we talk a lot about the differences between sectors, but there are also differences within a sector and within an organization that need to be discovered and brought to light before a partnership can move forward. And lastly, we have the thematic category of championship. So with the Arapahoe project, the bike manager and the Business Improvement District champion worked hand in hand with a relational contracting style to be able to move the project forward. And why this is important is because a nonprofit public partnership is usually guided without a contract, without a formal contract. And so in this case, the bike manager and the Business Improvement District worked hand in hand, communicating throughout the entire process, and also had a past relationship to build this relational contracting style on. With the Hamline project, instead of having just one champion within the Business Improvement District on Broad Avenue, there were multiple champions. And because of how long it took for the project to go through its design review process and to be constructed, which will happen in a couple months, there's been also a change in who's the champion, who is the bike manager within the local government. And so one of the project owners spoke to this. Because the Hamline had multiple leaders, no one really championed it. But when the administration changed and there was a lapse between bike managers, there just has not been the same level of advocacy. So we think about this in terms of collaboration structures and leadership. So partner champions are needed during critical phase transitions. And if you can remember, infrastructure is a phased process, so this is especially important. And if you have too many champions, it could lead to a diffusion of accountability. So no one is there to actually guide the project from beginning to end. And this leads us to our third proposition. Cross-sector partnerships must have clear and consistent leadership. So it's speaking to this, but even more so because infrastructure is a phased and networked public service. So, that's a lot of information. We're going to wrap it up really quick with this fun diagram that's been with us the whole time. Crowdfunding creates an already know that. That's what this dotted line is showing. And the importance of having relational contracting and consistent championship in a relational contract is imperative. And so we see that this information exchange needs to be a lot stronger between the project sponsor and the project owner. Each partner must be willing to take on the right responsibilities, so the responsibilities best align with their own resources and expertise. That's here. And lastly, infrastructure requires alignment within and not only between organizations. So we're going to see that in there. Great. So now we're going to move forward in part 3, considering how would we have advised the Memphis City engineer on putting together this cross-sector partnership and accepting these crowd-funded dollars at the very beginning of our case study. So, here we go, into part 3. And to understand how we would advise him, it's important to take into consideration what these other 2 lenses are. So we're going to talk about that briefly. So lens 1 on financial intermediation really came from the position that infrastructure assets are difficult to value. We talked about its networked characteristics, that there's an importance of localness in intermediating infrastructure investments. There's been hesitation on behalf of private investors who are not local to these projects and investing in projects that are infrastructure, geographic-based, networked, because they don't understand the true value of them. And so we're curious in how do crowdfunding platforms facilitate investments in local infrastructure assets from different capital-giving agents. And to understand this question, we used close dialogue method, which meant that I conducted intimate interviews with industry professionals from crowdfunding platforms, and with the help of 2 amazing research assistants, conducted industry review of nearly 70 crowdfunding platforms that work specifically on infrastructure investments and donations. And so what we found from this is that infrastructure crowdfunding platforms can help communicate local knowledge, the value of an infrastructure asset, from crowdfunders to non-local investors. So this exchange of information becomes very key, and as the number of crowdfunders increases, it sends a signal to funds and investors that may not be local to the infrastructure asset, trying to attract more capital from them. Lens 2, which we didn't have a chance to talk about today, was around social movements. And in particular, that consensus movements, as opposed to conflict movements or protest movements, support government's actions, and in this case, supports the construction of an infrastructure asset that the government wants. So the research question here was, how does crowdfunding as a consensus social movement tactic affect dynamics during infrastructure delivery? We used very similar methodology for conducting this research, and we're able to find that by initiating and managing the crowdfunding campaign, the project sponsor, so in our case the Business Improvement District, becomes a more powerful and knowledgeable decision maker. So this is able to motivate and influence the project owner to a much larger extent. Here they get bigger. Okay, but as with all research, we know that there are limitations, and this actually prompts us to future research. So we know that crowdfunding is a nascent field, especially crowdfunding for infrastructure. So there's limited, if any, theoretical understanding of this phenomenon. And so what we'd like to do in the future is continue to incorporate other theories and these propositions that have been found through this research to really validate what's going on. Generalizability. We talked today about 2 crowd-funded projects, but there's potential to expand this research to more crowd-funded projects as they become more prevalent. Units of analysis. I sent out a survey and the invitation for this presentation today. A lot of you were interested in how crowdfunding motivates and perpetuates inequality in the communities and why people are actually motivated to crowdfund. And whereas today we focused on the stakeholder network as a whole, I didn't have a chance to talk about the crowdfunders. And so I would like there to be future research around interviews with crowdfunders and spatial analysis of where these crowdfunders actually are. Transference between crowdfunding models. So we talked today a lot about donation-based crowdfunding, but there's also debt and equity-based crowdfunding. And what does it actually mean to transfer these findings to those other models of crowdfunding? So using case research of those debt and equity crowdfunded projects can help illuminate that. But why do we actually care, right? Why do we care? Well, when a lot of you were asked, do you agree with this statement? Crowdfunding is a viable option for funding entire or parts of infrastructure projects. So these were your own responses from the survey I sent out. A lot of you said that you agree, but there are some of you that say you strongly disagree. And even if you strongly strongly disagree. Crowdfunding for infrastructure is happening throughout the country and throughout the world. And this is shown by 3 initiatives. So the city of Los Angeles has actually partnered with IOB to help crowdfund street improvement projects. The state of Michigan has worked with Patronicity to help improve public space projects in Ann Arbor and Detroit and Lansing through crowdfunding. And lastly, probably the largest initiative of all is in London, England, where the mayor of London has partnered with SpaceHive as the crowdfunding platform to channel more than £1 million worth of dollars of his own to help match projects that are being crowdfunded on the ground. And over this last round, I think this was their 5th or 6th round that they've done this program, they were able to crowdfund successfully 80 projects that they had going on throughout the city. So, wrap this up with some theoretical contributions. So we know today that crowdfunding platforms that focus on infrastructure are modified financial intermediaries that understand the value of geographic assets like infrastructure. Crowdfunding signals a consensus project-based social movement different from other project-based social movements. So we've seen a lot of protest movements against real estate projects, against large pipeline projects, but consensus movements as motivated by crowdfunding are actually supporting the construction of projects. And lastly, critical factors for informal cross-sector partnerships, especially in terms of infrastructure, which is a phased, network, and resource-intensive process. So, without further ado, I'm going to acknowledge all the incredible people who helped me throughout this journey, because this is not a one-woman show, believe it or not. So, I'd really like to thank my reading committee, in particular Doug McAdam, who came here from sociology and had faith in me as an engineer to become a social scientist, and Ashby Monk, who is just a force to be reckoned with in terms of infrastructure investment. I'd like to thank the oral examiners, Dr. Martin Fisher and Bruce Kane, whose own work has been influential not only for my own research, but for research throughout this building and world, I guess. In trying to pursue crowdfunding and crowdsourcing research, it was really important that the research participants be on board and invest their time, resources, skills, knowledge in this research. And I could not have done it without the incredible stories I've heard from community activists who have been a part of this journey since day one, and the municipal leaders and industry partners who have been there along the way as well. In particular, I was hosted by 3 amazing organizations. Building Memphis is a civic organization in Memphis, Tennessee I worked with, and they hosted me while I was there for a summer. The Global Projects and Organizations Research Group in Boulder, Colorado. And lastly, I was in London this past summer, where I was looking specifically at the future of this research and the crowdfunding initiatives that are going on in London. I had 3 research assistants, 2 of whom are here today. Thank you so much for your help on this work. I was also funded by a host of organizations that really believe in cutting-edge research and emerging phenomena and what is going on in terms of infrastructure delivery. I'd also like to thank administration and staff, in particular these 3 ladies, and the incredible support system that's come here today. So this is the Global Project Center, who I've worked with very closely, PhD friends, and lastly, my friends and family. So I really appreciate you being an epic support network through this sometimes lonely and isolating process of pursuing a PhD. I don't think I could have done it without your support and love. And lastly, I'd like to do a special thank you for Dr. Ray Levitt. So if you don't know, Ray is actually retiring in July, so this is one of his last oral defenses he'll have to go through. And in preparation for today's defense, one of his last, we actually sent out a survey to all of his past PhD students. And so I know he's been super influential in my own PhD work, and he's the first person who ever had faith in me doing a PhD, and has been there through all of the ups and downs. But in contacting all of his PhD students, they wrote back to me words and words about how he is as a mentor. So not only is he entrepreneurial and insightful and wise, but he's also caring and supportive. And there are just a few quotes that were extra special I wanted to read from a few of his students. So he was accepting and cared that I chose the path that was right for me, which is very unusual for advisors. I know a lot of you can speak to this. And he really cared and was a true champion of me, not just the research. His mentorship taught me how to see the world through a more human-focused lens, which has had a lasting impression on how I manage and work with others around me. He showed me what sagely advice looks like in heated public forums and just generally changed my perspective on living a purposeful life with real humility, which is true. And lastly, he taught us all that you don't need to cross the river alone. You just need to lay down the next step so that those following you do not fall. So, thank you, Dr. Levitt. I really appreciate you being with me throughout this entire journey. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today, and I'll open it up for questions and answers.
Crowdfunding of public works projects. So do you think that it's like it could make it harder to pass traditionally funded public works projects because crowdfunding is an option, or does it just expand by adding a new revenue stream? Because I think you almost touched on sort of potentially skew public works projects toward people with disposable income, or towards those that would benefit those with disposable income.
I mean, this has been a continuous conversation with people who have participated in these projects. Whenever anybody asks me, should we crowdfund something? It's always, it depends. Because these projects are getting crowdfunded 5% of the total costs, and it's really a show of social support for a project to move forward. And so it's to move a project higher up on the priority list for the local government. Saying that, all the project sponsors I talk to recognize that crowdfunding is a one-off solution. It is something that is used to bring forward and lobby the local government to move something forward. In terms of donation-based crowdfunding for civic projects that are typically provided by the local government. And in that way, if it's going to take a crowdfunded campaign to show that social support and not just the number of people showing up at a community event, and that's one way that project sponsors are seeing that they can move projects forward and be an activist in their own communities. Saying that, in terms of talking about inequality and how it perpetuates inequality, perhaps, I can only speak to the projects I saw in detail. The crowdfunding aspect comes in after a lengthy process of community engagement. So the business improvement districts in both of these areas are tied very closely to the stakeholders that live on the streets and work on the streets that these projects were being constructed. So to gain support for the crowdfunded campaign, they set up, if they even painted the own bicycle lane themselves to show support for the project and to see the community interact with the project in a way that really brought to light the true benefits of the project. Like we said, crowdfunding for infrastructure relies on the fact that infrastructure is a local networked asset. So without actually experiencing it, you don't know the true benefits of it. And so they really tried to engage with their communities beforehand, regardless of what their income level was, so that they had support moving forward, not just financially, but socially.
So it sounds like I should feel good.
You can feel however you would like to feel about that. Yeah. Alyssa.
How do you see like the longevity of crowdfunding? I guess I'm thinking about how now we have smartphones, everyone has it, we have Uber, we have this, these kind of more sharing, etc. So kind of where do you see the trajectory of this?
Yeah, so just speaking to those 3 large initiatives that happened in LA, Michigan, and the city of London, like regardless of if people are getting more on their phones, organizations are getting excited about crowdfunding, and not just donation-based crowdfunding, but debt and equity. And so we can talk about that in a different question, but a lot of people are interested in this. Austerity for local governments is a real thing, and so organizations like the City of London sees this as a way to move forward, smaller, more local projects that communities need, but often fly under the radar. And so, yes, smartphones are great. We use them today in this presentation. They actually are connecting people to these projects just by showing them that they're online. Whereas before, you would get a notice in the newspaper, or you would see a sign walking down the street that there's going to be a public meeting for a new project. Now there's an online site where you can actually see what the project is looking like throughout its different stages. Thanks, Scott.
Lovely talk. I like, especially, you can imagine your focus on context. And your context notions are too small. Denver and Memphis within this larger context of, much more attention to the environment, problems with governments raising funds, environmental concerns, the spread of bikes and rental systems. And so there's a huge context that's fueling this particular movement at this time. And you need to sort of take that into account. These larger forces are very much, the wind is at your back, in short.
Right. And that, I think, is the beauty of grounded theory work, is that you get to bring in all of this context, understand it, and I am more than happy to share my dissertation with you. The narratives for both of these projects actually are too long to be published with the papers that will go to journals, so they will sit in the back of my dissertation and talk about all the factors you talked about. So the environmental, the legal standing of each of these communities, what the neighborhood's relationship is like with local government, all of these factors are important in how crowdfunding emerged in these very different contexts to deliver very similar projects. All right, that's kind of cop out, but back here.
Thank you for that presentation. So you hinted a little bit about this in your future directions slide, but I'm curious what types of infrastructure projects you see as more amenable to this, and what you think just would be.
Yeah, so this is a question I've been asking myself a lot about recently. You've probably heard that the border wall was crowdfunded. Over $20 million was crowdfunded from about 300,000 people. I am not going to state my opinion on something like that, but if you think about the networked aspect and the true benefits of a local infrastructure project, they're really only understood by individuals who live close to them. And in the past, those individuals have not been able to give to projects and really express their support in this way unless a tax measure comes out on the ballot, and you really can't donate in an external way to local governments to deliver this. So for donation-based crowdfunding, it's important that these projects, in speaking to project sponsors, they support this, that there is community engagement and support for these projects, number one. And number two is that you have the right stakeholders, the right partners in place to offer complementary resources for moving that project along, and the government is on board. Because at the end of the day, they're the one who's going to operate and maintain the asset. So, Bruce.
So you're actually operating within a nested crowdfunding environment.
Yes.
So the BID, Building Business Improvement District, has taxing authority.
Yes.
And self-taxing authority. So it's already a crowdfunding network, and then someone from the outside is bringing in different. What are the preconditions that you're looking for to sort of re-nest these layers? Government itself being a nested party to crowdfunding.
Interesting. I can only speak to this slightly, but business improvement districts are a really innovative way of funding general infrastructure in the area to increase the aesthetics so that more people want to come to the business improvement district and spend their dollars more, and so the tax then increases and they're able to reinvest that tax. Generally how it works. Crowdfunding is able to bring in not only the businesses that are part of the business improvement district, but people who are traveling nearby. So bicycle lanes are really catering not only to the businesses that are on it, but from people on either sides of the business improvement district who are going to be using that infrastructure. So this is a way to capture dollars that are outside the business improvement district by people who will actually benefit from traversing on a protected bicycle lane. And so that sort of speaks to business improvement districts pretty local. Crowdfunding is able to expand that radius a little bit more, and then hopefully the local government is able to think more about its connections with other bicycle lanes in the entire city.
There's a value exchange form between the amenity the business improvement district wants to increase traffic, to increase revenue to the sales to the businesses. So if you didn't have the BID to capture that value,
right,
you would make certain amenities, unfunded.
Yeah, that's true. And crowdfunding doesn't need to be associated with a business improvement district, so it sort of lends itself there. I think that's where you're leading. Okay, thank you. Dan?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Like you alluded to in the introduction, one of the main themes of the American city is segregation based on racial lines. And I'm wondering if in your vast data collection you ran across themes related to racial segregation and its contemporary manifestation in gentrification. Because when I look at the picture here, if any
Memphis.
tensions like
Yeah.
that came across.
Yeah. Yes, and I do want to preface this by I am not a race expert. I'm not an expert in this, but in looking at Memphis in particular, Binghamton, which is the neighborhood that the HAMP line goes through, is a very disinvested neighborhood. It is primarily minorities who live there. And I spent a lot of time with citizens who live in the neighborhood talking to them about their stories. The Business Improvement District, on the other hand, is a cashless, mostly cashless businesses that are part of it. So if you can imagine, this neighborhood is particularly underbanked, cannot really participate to the same extent in the Business Improvement District. And so they're really not reflective of each other, but there is huge work within Binghamton around bicycle repair, bicycle infrastructure as a way to get individuals outside of this neighborhood to other parts of the city. So they're actually benefiting from this, even though they might not be able to use their credit cards to go online to donate to this project. And so that's what was really important about the Business Improvement District. Worked with 2 other civic organizations in the area to really catalyze engagement with these members, with the community of Binghamton, to understand what they needed in terms of bicycle infrastructure. This is also in the stories in the back of my dissertation, which I can share with you, that speaks to this sort of controversial and the segregated history of Memphis, and in particular this one neighborhood. Natasha.
Kind of along the same lines as cross-sector partnerships, have you come across in your research a crowd-funded infrastructure project that has been completed not as relatively recently, that's seen problems, and then where does the funding then nucleate, like what government organization or private local group starts thinking about how do we upkeep, like a cracked concrete bicycle lane or things like that?
So the oldest crowd-funded asset in my memory in the United States is actually the Statue of Liberty.
Oh.
So it was crowd-funded by Pulitzer. In his newspaper, he sent out an ad that said, please give whatever you can. They were able to collect a lot of money from thousands of people that way for that project, and it seems to be doing pretty well today. But in terms of both of these projects, they saw some similar and also different outcomes in terms of what you're talking about. So the project sponsor, the Business Improvement District in Memphis, decided that they were going to construct 1/3 of the bike lane on their own. So they raised dollars through a private donor for the construction aspect. And when they went to go construct the asset, the construction manager actually found soft soil. So this is an unforeseen condition, what we call in construction management, and you really need to have contingency, so extra dollars in place to pay for unforeseen conditions. But because they had raised money for the exact construction by scope for the construction part, there was no contingency to pay for this unforeseen condition. So what ended up happening is the construction manager had to make a donation, both materials and labor, to be able to deal with this problem. So that's really the partner stepping up to fill in that void. And if there was more of a formal contract between the nonprofit, the Business Improvement District, and the city of Memphis and how they're going to deliver this project, probably could have done some work beforehand to understand what the unforeseen conditions could be or to include contingency for them. On the other hand, the support around bicycle lanes in Denver has actually resulted in this new website being created where citizens actually post every single time there's an issue with bike lanes. So if there's someone parked in the bike lane, even if there's a police officer parked in the bike lane, they can go online and post it, and then it goes straight to the local government, and they send out enforcement, hopefully not the same police officer, to then go deal with all of these issues. Taylor.
So a lot of what we've been talking about in the question section is circled around citizen engagement with the particular design and scope of a project. So in the cases you studied, do you think that it was mostly the project sponsor, someone like the Business Improvement District, which was responsible for reaching out to citizens and potential, let's say, small-scale individual stakeholders for input on design and scope? Or did you see any areas where, let's say, like, that was ability to comment on design and scope of the project was a complement to the crowdfunding aspect of the project?
So it's sort of like this cycle. So like you go out and engage and get consensus from people about the bicycle explain, and then once design starts, because now it's being funded by crowdfunding, or in some cases by external parties, to some extent, then goes into another round of cycles. So conceptual design is really, what does it generally look like? So that's the nice schematic I showed you at the very beginning. Whereas that detailed design was actually where the business improvement districts went out with the blueprints to all the business owners and said, does this conflict with your egress, exit for, say, your food vendor on Saturdays? We know you have a food vendor come here. Do we have to remove the poles? Should we design around that? And that's where they came in for the detailed design to really understand how it was going to, how that community engagement, which they've continued on, is actually going to improve the design of the asset at the end of the day. That's sort of how. But it's because they set up this relationship and they also knew the context that they were working in, that they were actually able to have these relationships. So the local governments in both cases don't have enough capacity to hold such intimate one-on-one sessions with the local businesses on how this one bike lane is going to impact their own business. But because they're trying to crowdfund from these individuals, they work with them on a continuing basis, they're actually in a better position, and the local governments understand this, that they can better conduct an engagement with citizens themselves. Brian, I think this might be the last one.
Outstanding job. Kate, I'm thinking about the social movement aspects of this, the power of that, and the $4 trillion annual infrastructure deficit. Have you seen any examples where people are starting to use this tool for tax or user fee assessment?
Yeah. No, I don't think we really understand how to incorporate and build algorithms around what's happening here to then talk about what's going to happen in the future, but I can say that other tools are being used to help understand what citizens want and sort of build on a social movement around what's happening on the ground. So guerrilla urbanism tactics, we didn't talk about it today, but in San Francisco, the parklet movement, where people are replacing parking spots with small areas for people to dine in and to actually park, to be in a park, not to actually park your car, but to actually be in a park setting, has actually motivated the need for the city to generate revenue in some other way, whether it's through parking or another form, to actually build out parklets for citizens who actually want them. Another case, sort of capitalizing on this social movement, is using participatory budgeting. So allowing citizens to actually rank and prioritize the projects that are ready to be invested in, or actually not invested in, but be constructed at the end of the day. And so there are these new mechanisms that are capitalizing on civic technology like crowdfunding platforms to actually move the needle forward on how we can better utilize and make efficient use of the dollars we're putting into infrastructure.
Give some perspective to people on impacts on inequality. There were several questions about, people who could crowdfund are probably from wealthier neighborhoods. What's the average size of the crowdfunding contribution to IOB in Denver versus in Memphis? Are they different?
Yeah, I don't know the difference between the two. I can really just speak to just generally their average investment or donation on IOB is $20. And the ones that are really high are the cities, or I would say private sector or businesses that are close to these projects that are putting in a lot more for capital, community social responsibility initiatives. And so a lot of what they see in terms of once you get below like $100 is around $5, $10 in their donation. So both of these projects, Denver raised $36,000 from about 200, 300, 250, 254, I think. And then Memphis raised $72,000 from about 560. Don't quote me, but I think that's close. So, yeah, concerned with that. Are we out of time? Can we take one more?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
One more. So yeah, in the back.
Very good indication. One clarification. So talking about the size that has been raised by crowdfunding.
Yes.
What is the percentage of
Yes. Great question.
out of the total cost?
So, ends up becoming 5% of the total project, maybe less than that in some cases. But if you saw during our work on financial intermediation, the number of crowdfunders and just hitting your crowdfunded dollar amount is actually signaling to outside investors, and that includes businesses that are going to be donating to projects in the area, really signals to them that people on the ground want these projects and that they're collecting small numbers of dollars, like I discussed previously. So it's really the signaling effect that's signaling to governments that this project needs to be built, and signaling to other investors and businesses that this is actually a good project that's been well vetted by the community and can move forward and be successful.
And do you think that crowdfunding can be directly impact or contribute a financing capability of the project? Or
Yeah.
if you think that, I mean, because I've been hearing that crowdfunding has been just a minor advantage of the total cost, but have some other effect that is non-financial.
Right.
But if that becomes more like a major part of the financing, then do you think that there could be some potential conflict or some other bottlenecks using crowdfunding?
Yeah. We had a roundtable here in the spring, which we brought in a lot of crowdfunding platforms to sort of discuss the possibility of what you're talking about. And really, one of the solutions we discussed is this sort of phased crowdfunding effect. So if you use donation-based crowdfunding at first to really understand, is there a need for this project? Is this something that the community likes? Can we actually signal that there's local value for the project? Then as you move into the design aspect, things get a little more solidified, and maybe there is a revenue stream or availability payments that are associated with the project. You can move into debt-based crowdfunding, which we've seen in cities like Denver, where they take municipal bonds for a specific project, knock them down to $200, $300 so that individuals like you and I can invest, make it a debt tool for us. And then as you move into, more substantial, I would say you've really knocked out what the full design looks like, you know what the financial modeling is around a project, you could possibly open it up for equity crowdfunding. And we've seen that a lot for community solar, we've seen it a lot for real estate. And so by sort of aggregating and phasing in these crowdfunded models, the same way that infrastructure delivery is phased itself, can really draw a parallel to the risks at each stage and phase of infrastructure and bring in more dollars from maybe a larger radius of people once you understand the true local value of the infrastructure.
Cool. Okay, I think
committee has to move to room 105. Sorry, guys. Okay. If y'all can please take the coffee and the food with you. Not coffee. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate you all coming today and asking such great questions.